Our topic is gender, sexuality, and imperialism, and we would like to go through the roots, the history of it, in a way, by looking at the case of Puerto Rico, um, and hopefully you will understand why, the reasons more in terms of power politics. Um, so, basically, the book starts with the neoconservative arguments that there is something about the members of racialized minority groups themselves, particularly how they form families and raise their children, that produces their lack of political and economic success as groups. This is one of the really dominant views among neoconservatives and conservatives, that some minority groups um, are in this way, whatever this way means, because of their family structure and because of their motherhood or because of their children raising habits and things like this. Of course, this argument is very much ingrained with a lot of racial prejudices and cultural prejudices about certain groups, which may not have any empirical evidence to prove. And we will go through the intricacies of what are those scholarly works that try to prove this, or scholarly works that actually disproves this kind of assumptions and arguments about some minority groups having different family structures leading them to lack of political and economic success. We should look a little bit of the history of this. Probably, I don't know if maybe some of you are a bit more older. Maybe you remember the term welfare queen. Maybe it's still used in certain magazines and cultural industry. I put this small cartoon for reminding you sometimes how ridiculous it sounds. It's the fairy tales of the rich and the famous. And it says, once upon a time there was a wicked welfare queen who had the power to destroy entire economies with one AFTC check. AFTC check is probably you know better than I do, the aid to families for children. So, welfare queen, this is from Wikipedia, is a pejorative phrase to refer to people, usually women, who are accused of collecting excessive welfare payments through fraud or manipulation. The term entered the American lexicon during Ronald Reagan's 1976 presidential campaign, shortly after he described a woman abusing welfare from Chicago's South Side, but he never used the term welfare queen when referencing the woman. So Reagan's period is well known being the start of neoliberalism in the United States and in almost everywhere else. And this basically promotes the idea that everyone has to work, everyone has to be part of the labor force. If they can't, for one or other reason, then they are abusing the system by getting welfare. And we all know that American healthcare system is not the most welfare one, including Medicaid expansion that needs the most, but still, this is ideology that is promoted, very common in the United States, to think about if you don't work, you don't deserve state services, kind of logic. And this is of course attributed to women mostly. The queen is reference to sexuality and gender of women, giving some extra discrimination against women who receive some welfare, against single mom with a certain racial status. They always give to. The other myth or other very conservative argument is as the culture of poverty argument, which is coined by Oscar Levy in his 1961 book, The Children of Sanchez. Levy based his thesis on his ethnographic studies of small Mexican communities. His studies uncovered approximately 50 attributes shared within these communities: frequent violence, a lack of a sense of history, and neglect of planning for the future, and so on and so forth. Despite studying very small communities, Levy extrapolated his findings to suggest a universal culture of poverty. More than 45 years later, the premise of the culture of poverty paradigm remains the same, that people in poverty share a consistent and observable culture. So this is a very, very dangerous argument, and colonial anthropologists use this argument a lot. The reason why certain groups fail is because they are backward, quote unquote, culture. And it's observable for some reason. And even if it's a small community that Levy was looking at, they can easily extrapolate these to a lot of other people. These are poor nations because their culture is backward kind of argument, which is given by modernization theorists most of the time. You don't have to know all those details. The only thing you should know is the culture of poverty myth and how poverty is associated with female and women in general, in many cases, and many scholars worked on this thesis and found out actually there is no such thing as culture of poverty. Differences in values and behaviors among poor people are just as great as those between poor and wealthy people. So it is not about the poverty being driven by culture or wealth being driven by culture. It is a lot of varieties going on. In actuality, the culture of poverty concept is constructed from a collection of smaller stereotypes, which, however false, seem to have crept into mainstream thinking as unquestioned fact. If you actually, as a scholar, if one of us wants to design a research that will reproduce all the stereotypes about certain populations, we could easily do that, and we can pretend as if it is scientific. And we will talk about it a bit more in the Puerto Rican case. But this is basically almost racism creeping into the mainstream thinking with unquestioned facts. And most of the time, poverty is racialized and sexualized. So the racialization part is basically it becomes like reciprocal cyclical process. The notions of culture of poverty, the welfare queen, this is attributed to certain racial groups, and it became reciprocal and cyclical. And the racialization of Puerto Ricans as Negroes, Hispanics emerged a bit later in the history, and the inscription of both groups' principal characteristic as their bad families. So the family structure is blamed for poverty. When we come to the sexualization, the Puerto Rico case is a very, very interesting one, because from the exotic tropical prostitute, seductive but brimming with disease, to the impoverished overlarge family, produced by ignorance and brainwashing by the Catholic Church, to overpopulation, to the notion of the culture of poverty, Puerto Rican sexuality has been defined by its deviance, and the island as a whole has been defined by its sexuality. So, I'm reading this very slowly because this is very important. Through historical power struggles, the structure of woman, the image of woman in Puerto Rico, which is a colonized land, we will look at the history of Puerto Rico and the status of Puerto Rico in a very, very short time period now, that we will see all these power networks and the hegemonic ideas and ideologies come together and define a Puerto Rican woman and its sexuality and her sexuality. It is a matter of this as an object of desire, as exotic tropical prostitutes. Although it brings disease as well, so it's a public health issue. When she migrated to the mainland, United States, although Puerto Rico is part of the United States as well, to the impoverished overlarge family, the overpopulation, and its backwardness to modern family structure. So this is very much intertwined with the culture of poverty that I was talking about, how a certain culture is blamed to be poor because of its culture, backward culture. So as you can see, it's a very intersectional story, which we can't even define the differences between race, class, and gender. It is very much intertwined, and by intersectionality we mean actually these are inseparable. inseparable in many ways. So let's go a bit more. So let's get a break for history a little bit. So when it comes to the status of Puerto Rico, many people think it's another state, which is not the case. It has a Commonwealth status, which means it is still a colony. Many people don't have, not many people actually, Puerto Ricans don't have the right to vote for presidential elections in the United States. It has a very specific status, and almost every now and then there are plebiscites, the referendum, for its status. But the actual irony is all these plebiscites are non-binding. So the Congress of the United States will decide on the political status of Puerto Rico for a long time now. And it was colonized in 1887, if I'm not wrong. Anyway, check it if you if you are not sure. And this is basically the story of many people blamed these plebiscites as a show-off of democracy by United States with a bit of irony, because it's not non-binding and nothing changed in terms of status according to these referenda. So this is just a table of what people voted in the referenda until 1967 till 2012. And in 2012, Obama actually promised that he will keep his promise in terms of giving whatever Puerto Ricans want to do with their land. But this turned out to be not valid, and although Puerto Ricans voted 60%, more than 60% Puerto Ricans voted for statehood, I think it has still Commonwealth status, which means they still don't have the vote to presidential elections. Anyway, if you want to know more about what's going on about political status of Puerto Rico and its history, I put the links here, here and here. You can check the trailers of a very well-made documentary whose director got Emmy Awards before. This is only the trailer. I'm pretty sure you can find the documentary from Amazon to rent it or something if you would like to watch it. So go ahead if you're interested. So basically, why we are doing this in gender, sexuality, and health issues, because there is a lot of link between political rule and reproduction. If some of you, as some of you referred in the questions, if you got some lectures about population demography, population statistics, and etc., you know by heart now that the nation's population, that any state's population is very, very relevant to the political rule. So if you look at now, just as an example, India and China, we will see that they have a really big, like, great number of population, which means you have a really as a nation state, that from the view of the governors, that they have enough labor power, labor force, indispensable labor force, that can promote and produce for the other countries as well. Since we already know what is the global reorganization of labor, that outsourcing all the labor force to certain countries like India and China, that's producing for the first world, you can see that actually the number of people is a very, very important variable for the governors. And then this is actually linking to biopower of Foucault, as we saw before, that we take people as numbers and statistics, and it is rather the number of people that we think about than the well-being of the people in many ways. But if I mean, this is basically what most of the state and governors think. But still, these statistics are of course very important as well for policymaking reasons. So take your own position on these things. That knowing can be helpful for well-being of people, while sometimes knowing is there just to classify people, like racial categories, as we saw before. Anyway, so reproduction has been central to the work of racialization on the mainland, in the case of Puerto Rico, and equally so, reproduction and sexuality have defined the difference that makes colonialism in Puerto Rico possible and necessary. What makes them need our regulation and governance? So this is a question of legitimacy of imperialism and colonialism that, when we actually read the Colonial Legacies chapter from Paul Farmer's book, we saw that there has been a quiet hygiene is used, and a lot of other issues like these cultures are backward arguments were used and abused by the colonizers to legitimize their colonial rule and order, and to exploit the certain populations that they colonized. So they need an other, which is not normal in their case, and they define it by um, a lot of different tools. The otherization of a population to rule becomes the legitimacy that the colonizers used to in general. In this case, in Puerto Rican case, the center is the woman and women's bodies, and reproduction. There have been a lot of studies that promote this inferiority to rule. One of them argues that the Puerto Rican tradition to form families without benefits among Puerto Rican immigrants, in New York and in other places in the mainland, it leads to welfare. And this is going to our welfare queen culture of power to discussion in the first slides. And the weird that this is an argument by Chavez, a neoconservative scholar, and this is wrong empirically, because there was actually aid for families in the island as well, because it is stated as part of the United States anyway. So if it wasn't the case in Puerto Rico, then it's not gonna be the determining variable for Puerto Rican immigrants as well, because nothing changed when they move. And the funny thing is that they are internal immigrants according to the law, but they are treated as an outsider in general. So, and still, after these wrong assumptions and arguments, the Puerto Rican family structure has been pathologized as the source of poverty and the source of like public health issues. Other neoconservative discourses continues with a lot of prejudices as well. The excessive birth rate was blamed for the slowness and limitations of industrial development on the island and for contemporary Puerto Rican poverty on the mainland. There's also a policy response to overpopulation problem argument, whatever you want to say. The development of new birth control technologies and the widespread use of surgical sterilization was pioneered in Puerto Rico. As a response to these kind of thinking and discourses, which may not have a real implication and a real basis evidence. And the industrial development is limited in Puerto Rico because of excessive birth rate for some reason, while it is the opposite for China and India right now, as we know that the population increase actually leads to more industrial development. So this is the argument has never been really corroborated in many ways in scientific studies. Why do they need to legitimate their colonial rule? Because through reproduction, what I meant. Because what they mean is that the colonial governors, the colonizing elite, needs need to produce the other as inferior, and this has been first theorized in detail by Edward Said. I hope you have heard him, or if you have read him in Contemporary Theory. He is an American Palestinian comparative linguistic scholar. He died, and he basically writes extensively on the way Europeans produce the East as inferior, lacking, and hence in need of colonization, by making it into a subject of literature and scholarship and science, linguistics, history, and geography. So the ideas and culture industry, the literature, the scholarship, the science, linguistics, history, geography are important domains and sites of producing knowledge to convince people that these others are inferior and lacking certain issues and infrastructure or certain cultural morals or a lot of other things that they need to be colonized. And this has been going on for a long, long time. And of course, when a lot of people say from inside or outside colonized countries, post-colonial states, like India or many states in Africa, they basically, as we saw before, like in 1884, the Europeans the Western Europeans divided the Africa in the Berlin Conference, just like it is, like just on the map. So all these things that they can do, they could do, and they could legitimize to their own citizens as well by saying that these people are inferior. We have to do something. We have to save them from their own ignorance. As we were referring to white man's burden before, like to give soap to them to clean themselves. And this is of course a lot of this has a lot of lack of knowledge because they don't really listen to those people, what they need, what they want, and etc. They just make them subjects rather than objects to um, to basically the ones who is in need of governing and ruling by somebody else. They are treated as if they are childish. They don't know. For a long time, for example, one of the best examples I've heard about these things is in the Amazon. Some of the tribes, they basically were burning forests, and when the colonizers arrived, and the colonizers said are pure savages, like they burn their own villages and forests. It's not villages, it's only forests, and basically afterwards, a lot of climatologists and a lot of forest scientists and etc. In the modern period looked into what they were doing. They were actually making the soil more fertile by burning it, and they were making environment more vivid by burning it, and they knew how much they should have burnt and how much they shouldn't, and they knew what is their relationship with the nature there, so that they can actually promote some agriculture. It is actually, and they actually inspired a lot of modern forest agricultural industry through doing this, because there were some regions who could do the same, but they didn't know. So it is also a lack of knowledge. You don't know in certain environments when you go there, when there is indigenous peoples there, and you don't know what their relationship with the nature is. I'm not saying that it's always like that, but this is only one example that can tell you that this attribution of cultural norms, backward and forward, progressive or not, is actually not making sense if you don't know well, if you don't listen to people, if you don't have even the language to talk to them. So what Edward Said was referring to is that the Europeans produced the East as inferior and lacking for their own goods, actually, not for their own conscience, not for their not for the benevolence of the other. They're not benevolent masters. They were exploiting those lands and they needed a legitimate ground. Some of them probably really believed what they were saying as like we are saving them, kind of culture, but it is neither true nor nor in demand of people. You basically ignore the agency of those people, who is from different culture, different race, different group or ethnicity. And what we should know with culture is always very much intertwined with economy. And the Puerto Rican inferiority in this case is produced through knowledge about the bodies and behavior of Puerto Rican women. Puerto Rican difference is presented in popular culture and public policy debate through women's sexuality and reproduction, through their inordinate attachment to family, lack of work ethic, and excessive use of welfare, and in their promiscuous sexuality in the island's overpopulation and in the culture of poverty. So these were the arguments that were never really fully established or evidenced, that they base their argument, the colonizers, the colonizers base their arguments on Puerto Rican difference by focusing on Puerto Rican women's sexuality in a very weird way. This is very common in colonialism history. There's a case, if you want to know, I didn't put the link here, but I can send you the link if you're interested. There's a very famous case that a woman from Martinique is brought in the end of 19th century to London, and by a British person, British male. She is her name is Sarah Bartman, and she is an African woman, and she was basically taken into circus-like events and show her genitals and her bottom to everyone as a case, as an entertaining case, I guess, horribly. And people watch her and try to look her genitals to understand what's going on and why is it so interesting. It's all about women's sexuality. And then they were thinking if there's something weird because her bottom is a bit bigger. Although it is anyway, I don't want to sound. It's really a very sad story because she followed that man as a husband, I guess, and he took her to the metropoles of Europe, Paris, London, I think Berlin, to show her body parts. And in 1930s, I think she died very early age because she was very stressed and overworked. And those things, I think there is a bit of prostitution involved in those things as well, because it is a very desirable other, as an objectified woman by white men. And her genitals were taken into French Scientific Institute, French Institute of Science, even until today, because they thought there is something interesting about her genitals, which is still sounding horrible, I know. And they thought it's for science. They want to know the parts of her, which is obviously not different than any other woman. And they kept her bodily parts. They didn't bury her, although she wanted to. Before she died, they basically put her parts in an institute to do eugenics. And in the part that you read, you heard a lot of eugenics, I guess, in the book. Eugenics means scientific movement for race. Basically, a lot of racist scientists thought that different races have different sexualities, different health issues, different like sex biology we were talking about. Like this is race biology, eugenics, and then in many ways it established after Darwinian evolution theory that they thought that white race was more evolved than the black race, and they actually followed those paths. So anyway, I'm making it more. But this is what I'm trying to say is like women's sexuality were always there as a matter of colonial issue to rule among colonizers and nationhood as well. So why woman body is significant? In this case, reproduction. Elon Findley, a scholar, has argued for 19th century Puerto Rico that sexuality becomes explicitly politicized at certain historical moments, and this seems to be particularly true in times of change and transition. And the colonization was one of them. One can extend that insight to say that sexuality and reproduction are used to produce change and transition as well. So it is a very intertwined relationship that sexuality and reproduction can be part of the change or the transition, or change and transition can change the sexuality and reproduction. So the tropical and colonized bodies of Puerto Rican women have been tremendously useful for an astonishingly broad array of players seeking political power, authority, and legitimacy in Puerto Rico. For feminists, nationalists, the US military, the federal government, philanthropists, and academic scientists and social scientists, it has been important to know Puerto Rican women's bodies and to rescue, condemn, or defend working class women. This fact has been important to the US imperial project on the island, especially in terms of rescuing the women. So basically, these women bodies are victimized in a different way, like they are giving birth, poor woman, we have to give them birth control means to do this. Or another discourse is like, oh, poor woman under colonization, we should give them more rights to more sexual rights to do this or that. So, so this basically this victimization discourses, um, which may or may not be true, by the way. This is the importance of discourse that you should know. It's a very, very important concept. You may heard about it, you may not heard about it before, but it's basically truth-making processes. That truth is not there, but there are a lot of political powers arguing for the truth, including science, political rules, medicine, a lot of other things that victimize the woman. Um, but this victimization discourses, first of all, is leading into let's rescue this woman, let's save this woman. You can see the same issue with Afghan regime and the invasion of Afghanistan by U.S. military. The Taliban regime was making women suffer under their religious rule, which is partly true, but also saving women discourse is not the real reason by the military invasion, just like Iraq in a way. There are a lot of other political power issues going on in all these invasions and imperialisms by any powerful country in the world. So it is not a very, very white or black area. It's a very gray area. But saving the woman is not more than a discourse to cover a lot of other real politic issues. And this saving the woman discourse can lead to, as I gave the example, imperialism or colonialism. And by colonialism, the author Laura Begins basically argues that a modernist institution, fundamentally a practice but of producing modern citizen subject in metropoles as well as colonies. So colonialism is not only about the colonized, it is also about the colonizer and the relationship between the metropoles and the colonies. By metropole, we mean the urban elite of the colonizers. So colonialism, as we know, primarily involved men, militarism, and economics. That it was an unfortunate thing that happened over there, far from the quotidian concerns of the metropole. By quotidian, we mean saving. Like we are gonna save them, we are gonna modernize them, we are gonna make them as civilized as we are. In a way, this is the concerns that you can think of about the discourse of colonialism, that US colonialism was either, for left commentators, among the worst in the history of the world, or for its mainstream minimizers, principally benevolent. And this is actually, both of them are very prejudiced in many ways. US colonialism just is another colonialism, in the history. And the Reproducing Empire book argues that colonialism was powerfully about the marked female questions of sex and domesticity, and that imperial prostitution policy was as much about making England or the United States modern as it was about domesticating India or Puerto Rico, that colonialism was systemic and coordinated, not disjointed, and that the ways in which the United States was imbricated in it were unremarkable, neither better nor worse, but simply another specific form of colonialism. Um, and when we look at the reproduction, birth control, eugenics, and overpopulation in Puerto Rico between 1920 and 1940s, we see three nationalisms in clash in Puerto Rico. One of them is the independent movement, independentista nationalism of Albizu. Albizu is one of the famous independent movement leaders in Puerto Rico, Puerto Rican local movement. Which identified women with motherhood, which in turn became the insides of nationhood. Mothers made citizens, reproducing both bodies and culture. This is a very, very common discourse all around the world about nation states and post-colonial states, that basically motherhood is attributed to women, and the mothers will give us the morals and make citizens better for us. And the second nationalism in clash in Puerto Rico in 1920 and 1940 years, North American nationalism. And this one sought protection for the white U.S. nation from too many of them, referring to working class and or dark-skinned Puerto Ricans or any other nations, people. It feared the reproduction of the lower classes, Puerto Ricans in general, and indeed all non-Nordics or non-Caucasian as we know it now. This is a very white supremacist nationalism argument, and this was the case competing with the other nationalism identifying women and its sexuality as too many of them reproducing those lower classes more and more. The more they are, we are losing our power to be the dominant race. Kind of logic is hidden in this part of nationalism. The third one is an interesting one because it's kind of in between, and it is a different one because it argues for a modernizing nationalism associated with missionaries, social workers, reformers, public health professionals, both Puerto Rican and North American. It doesn't matter. And they put the state of family as the key of the island, the key to the well-being of the island. Family is a very conservative value when you think about it as a conservative family, like a nuclear family, and that reducing large families, the number of irregular marriages, and the high maternal and infant mortality rates of the increasing landless rural subsistence farmers and urban and agricultural working classes was crucial to improving the economic status of the island, was the argument for those modernizing nationalists. And you may think that this is actually not morally wrong, but at the same time, you should all think that there is no voice or agency for women in any of those nationalisms. Women are symbolized as mothers, national symbols, controllable subjects, a mean to modernize, and something to rescue. And many other issues that seem to be giving no voice or agency for women. If you ever read Gayatri Spivak and then the Can the Subaltern Speak, you may recognize these topics from this reading in contemporary theory. Probably you did. If you don't, it's okay. It's post-colonial theorist, post-colonial Marxist theorist, who argues that the woman has always been subalternized. Subaltern is a term to make about the voice, that their voices will never be heard, kind of issue. Like a concept that says it's always represented by somebody else, that they don't represent themselves, they don't feel the entitlement to represent themselves, and this is the reciprocal way of inferiorizing them. So woman has no voice in any of those nationalisms, no agency to say anything about their own bodies and the birth controls, if they may want it, they may not want it. Nobody knows because nobody asked the actual woman. They only argued and discussed through the assumptions, the overpopulation argument, the statistical argument, these population strategies, the nation states building argument, or citizenry building arguments. So these are all these things that disregarding the woman as that as an embodied, structured person, rather than an individual, rather than a group that can be ruled or controlled or modernized or rescued. So when we go to the details of the birth control discourses in Puerto Rico on those time periods, 1920, 1940 again, birth control could upset physical and emotional balance, disrupt the nervous system, even cause cancer for women was an argument which has no leaning to any kind of scientific evidence. The Catholic one was more about the moral health. Contraceptions, they say, has always been condemned for reasons of moral health as an abominable crime, gravely immoral. And the reduced number of children of the families of the well-to-do suffered, for is it not a fact that such children, pampered by the exaggerated attentions of their parents, are almost always ill-behaved, nervous, egotistical, discontented, selfish, and lacking in energy and self-sacrifice? This is also church argument. Since it was used, the aid was given by the United States. A lot of people in the independent movement argued also for birth control was a foreign practice, non-Catholic practice, and it has been stated by many other people in different nation states as well. If they have a history of U.S. intervention or any imperial intervention by any powerful countries, then they basically say they've tried to reduce our population, which is a cleansing, which is genocide, which is a lot of discourses are over there about birth control, which may or may not have real implications. By the late 1930s, Catholicism, motherhood, and Puerto Ricanness had become so conflated in birth control rhetoric that mainland Catholics could use such rhetoric to speak on behalf of the Puerto Rican mother, even against the island's elected representatives. This became, as I gave reference to Spivak, this became more of an issue of who represents the Puerto Rican mother rather than what is the well-being of Puerto Rican mother issue, or even not mother, but woman in general. Woman does not necessarily have to be a mother to be important in terms of public health and sexual health. So also the overpopulation argument and discourses. So there's an entangled history of politics, statistics, and struggles over professional legitimacy here. Everyone talks about what is overpopulation, how it becomes overpopulated, and why overpopulation leads to poverty, which are all different hypotheses to check and find evidence for, which they didn't. In the context of Puerto Rico, another thread was interwoven as Jose Enamorada Cuesta, not sure I read it right, I hope you know Spanish more, noted overpopulation was also an economic theory. It's a theory, and the defense of the continued rule of the United States in the face of the apparent failure of US policy. So many people think it can be just a theory about why this is bringing poverty. So when we say overpopulation, we mean a population growing faster than wealth. But when you look at the same statistics that these people were looking at to say that Puerto Rico is overpopulated, we see that the per capita incomes of Puerto Ricans underwent spectacular increases from the second decade of the 20th century through the late 1920s. Most of this, however, was in sugar exports. Largely then increases in wealth were in the hands of North Americans on the island. So there's a huge income gap here between North Americans on the island and the Puerto Ricans. And if you look at just Puerto Ricans, then actually wealth is decreasing maybe, or wealth is the same. But in general, the per capita GDP per capita increases for the island. So the wealth is increasing actually, while the population is increasing as well. So the overpopulation argument is kind of failing here. It is more about the income inequality, but between the colonizer and the colonized. The North American sugar export, landowners and the actual population who is working under them. Also, there's a modern nation argument, which is about the same thing that I was referring before about the backward-forward logic. These endless offspring of our jibaros are the misfortune that retard our advancement. This is by the Commissioner of Health in Puerto Rico. He's Puerto Rican, and he basically says these endless offspring of our jibaros, the rural population, woman population, are the misfortune that retard our advancement. So they think themselves that these women are actually is hindering their advancement. The standard of our peasant families goes down every time a new child arrives to make the subsistence problem more difficult to resolve. By subsistence problem, we mean there's not enough resources for the population, which is again something that we should think about if it is true or not, because it can be the income gap or it can be the resources allocation. To be honest, if you give these land to the indigenous population or the Puerto Ricans, not the North Americans who came there to colonize, then they might have actually subsistence level as a pretty much okay status. And anyway, let's continue. And then little by little, there arises a rural generation. So you can see the inferiorization here as well, rural versus urban elite. They basically, it's bad to be rural. You can see it in the United States as well. The industrialization brings this discourse that the urban is always better than the rural generations. In lifestyles, I guess, I don't know. But in the world right now, as it is, we are suffering from agricultural means, which we should have more rural generations, to be honest. Anyway, so these are all ideological issues. Why rural is worse than urban? For what reason? Anyway, this is a reference to that as well. A rural generation undermined from their childhood, destined from before birth to pass unprofitably through life. What does it even mean? I'm sorry. Victims of themselves, of the fatal inheritance bequeathed them by their progenitors. We would be grateful if the government saw the way for our country to stop being so overcrowded and with residents without the opportunity to succeed in life. They basically want actually forced birth control almost here for their own nation's advancement. So this became the issue of public health rather than the tropics, because of all these ideologies and discourses coming together. Wrong ideas that have settled in the minds of non-residents need to be corrected. These include an image of the tropics inhabited by an inferior stock, poor, ignorant, and degenerated, of a physical and peculiar mental structure under a red-hot sun, wild and fierce animals and beasts, poisonous and annoying insects of all denominations, and in this immense wilderness people mixed and blended of all races and creeds without a definite personality, full of vice, degraded, and incapable of rising above this level, a queer and inferior people, lazy and indolent and powerless to organize a civilized community. The question is raised whether the stronger races through a natural instinct of selection occupied and inhabited the regions north and south of the tropics, and the powerless inferior races with no ambition and no initiative have remained in the tropics. This is obviously taken by a eugenist, a scientist who is racist at the same time, as you can obviously see, powerless inferior races that we talk about. And then it's not the sun, it's not the animals, beasts, objects. The language is as horribly naturalized in a way that they even dehumanize the other races, the inferior races. And it became a matter of public health after this issue. So there's a scientific activist called Gamble, American, who actually is promoting the overpopulation arguments, and they kind of won discursively over other discourses, and that they make certain policies done in the region. So Gamble, though outside the mainstream of contraceptive activism, read the research climate very well. Biological research on contraceptive methods had developed and remained firmly within the paradigm of concern about the overpopulation of colonized and formerly colonized regions alongside the profligacy of slum dwellers within the United States and Britain. The motivation for this research rested on a notion that it was better to prevent poor or dark-skinned people from being born, and it maintained a quiet, ambivalent relationship to the idea of white, affluent women voluntarily limiting their own fertility. So what is the end product of all these discourses coming together, and Gamble and his scholarly ambitions winning the argument over others? The belief that the ills of Puerto Ricans had been produced not by the tropical climate but by poverty. So they changed. It's the discourse changed from tropical climate, the hotness creating lazy nature of people, which is horribly racist, to be honest. And the discourse changed to poverty, and then the culture of poverty. Why they are lacking certain things is because of their poverty, that they had been caused by working class women through overpopulation. So they blame the woman. They put all the blame to women, working class women. Illegitimacy, overpopulation, bad diet, and housing. These are all environmental issues. This is not up to the woman as well. But we are not also sure that it is actually the case anyway. We won through eugenics. So eugenics won. The racist biology won in a way. Permitted more substantial federal interventions during the Depression in state-run industry, child feeding programs, and birth control. So they make Puerto Rico almost as a laboratory for birth control and child feeding programs by the state. So this is the end of it, in a way. I didn't go to Ethiopian woman because some of you asked why is this the case? Because there is a huge racism against immigrants all over the world by the nation-state governments. They don't want the immigrants to reproduce in their own land, so they don't want. If they reproduce in their own land, then they will have some kind of legitimacy to stay there, and they don't want to feed the other, although they might be the biggest workforce in their country, in a way, like Turkish Gastarbeiters, the guest workers in Germany. There are like almost 5 million now. That there are even people who didn't get citizenship, although they are third generation German. They grew up in Germany. But some of the countries, they don't want immigrants to reproduce in their own land, so that they don't give citizenship, or even if they are born, they restrict the citizenship law so much that they don't give them citizenship at all. So I hope all these issues make sense in a way that, like, it's a historical case. It is still relevant because I gave the Guardian article, the Haaretz article as well. It's not done. It's not out there. It is everywhere, and it is actually the nationalism, extreme nationalism, promoting all those ideas that the other is inferior. In this case, I would like you to see that they actually the other is woman. By any groups, any discourses, they make woman as the one to blame, as the one without no voice, as the one who symbolized the nation without having any voice or agency. So sexuality and reproduction has been very important in regard to population politics, and population politics has been very, very significant for any nation state to prove their nationhood to others, and the racial priorities in the nation can change the population dynamics and the reproductive health as well. And intervene certain sexualities, like giving injections, birth control injections to Ethiopians, not to without even their consent, as an unethical issue. There are many other cases that you can find out that is imposed on women in many ways. So hope it is not very horrific. It's horrific to listen all those stories, but I hope you have some hope to change certain aspects of public health as well, in a way. Have a good day, and please post your comments